What if the biggest story in women's basketball right now didn't happen during a game? Didn't happen during a press conference? And didn't even happen in front of cameras? What if it happened behind closed doors, in a quiet practice gym, where only a handful of people were supposed to see it? Because according to whispers now spreading through the basketball world, that's exactly what happened during a private national team scrimmage. A routine practice session that was supposed to confirm everything the coaching staff had already decided. A session that was meant to prove the veterans were still firmly in control. A session that was supposed to show exactly why the Olympic roster had already been finalized. But instead, something completely different unfolded. Inside that gym were some of the most experienced and respected players in the sport. Champions, all-stars, Olympic veterans, athletes who had spent years building reputations as the very best defenders and leaders in women's basketball. The expectation was simple. The hierarchy would hold. The veterans would set the tone. The younger players would fall in line. Then Caitlin Clark stepped onto the floor. And within minutes, the entire atmosphere reportedly shifted. Eyewitness accounts describe a moment that felt almost surreal. At first it looked like any normal scrimmage. Players running through sets. Coaches watching quietly from the sideline. Assistants taking notes. But once the ball started moving through Clark's hands, the rhythm of the game began to change in a way that nobody expected. She wasn't just playing fast. She was seeing things faster. Possessions that normally unfold in predictable patterns suddenly started breaking apart. Defenders who had built their careers on anticipation were reacting late. Passing lanes that looked completely closed were somehow opening. And before anyone fully understood what was happening, the scoreboard in that quiet gym was starting to tilt in a direction that left several people on the sideline exchanging confused looks. Then came the shots. Not the normal kind of shots that coaches expect during structured practice. These were the kinds of shots that usually make assistants shout, "No, no, no," before the ball even leaves the player's hands. Pull-ups from several feet beyond the three-point line. Deep, confident releases that looked almost casual the moment they left her fingertips. And one after another, the net kept snapping. No rim. Just that sharp sound every shooter dreams about hearing. Players who had guarded the best scorers in the world suddenly found themselves chasing someone whose range seemed to stretch the geometry of the court itself. By the time defenders stepped up to contest, the ball was already halfway to the basket. For a few seconds, the gym reportedly went completely quiet. Not the kind of silence you get during a normal drill. The kind of silence that happens when something unexpected forces everyone to pause and process what they just saw. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. The entire narrative surrounding Clark's absence from the Olympic roster had been built on a simple idea: that she needed more time, more development, more experience against elite professionals before stepping onto the international stage. The message from decision-makers had been consistent for months. The talent was real, but the moment wasn't ready yet. And yet here she was. Not looking overwhelmed. Not looking cautious. Not looking like someone waiting her turn. Instead, she looked like someone who had arrived with a very specific mission: to prove that the assumptions surrounding her ceiling had been completely wrong. Observers inside the gym started noticing something else too. The veteran defenders weren't just reacting to her shooting. They were reacting to the threat of it before she even touched the ball. Every time she crossed half-court, bodies shifted toward her direction. Help defenders leaned into the passing lanes. The defensive structure started bending in ways that opened opportunities for everyone else on the floor. That kind of offensive gravity is rare. It's the kind of effect that usually takes years to develop at the professional level. The kind of presence that forces an entire defense to reorganize itself around one player's abilities. But in that practice session, it appeared almost instantly. Which is why the conversation around that scrimmage didn't stay inside the gym for very long. Within days, quiet whispers started reaching reporters. Small details shared through coaching circles. Comments from people who were careful about exactly how much they revealed, but still couldn't hide the sense that something remarkable had happened behind closed doors. And as those stories began spreading across basketball media, one uncomfortable question started growing louder and louder. What if the most talked about rookie in the sport wasn't just ready for the global stage? What if she had already been the most dangerous player in the building? Because if the rumors about that scrimmage are even partially true, then the debate surrounding Caitlin Clark and the Olympic roster might be far from over. In fact, that quiet practice session may have just reopened one of the most controversial decisions the sport has faced in years. And what witnesses claim happened next on that floor would only make the entire situation even harder to ignore. By the time the scrimmage reached its second rotation, something unusual had already become impossible to ignore. The pace of the game was no longer being controlled by the veterans. It was being dictated by one player. According to people who were present during that closed-door session, Caitlin Clark didn't approach the scrimmage like a rookie testing the waters. She approached it like someone who fully expected to be the most dangerous offensive weapon in the gym. And that confidence showed immediately. The first few possessions looked ordinary enough. A few passes around the perimeter. A drive into the lane. The kind of rhythm coaches expect during early scrimmage minutes. But once Clark began initiating the offense, the entire structure of the floor started shifting. Defenders weren't just guarding her. They were reacting to the possibility of her. Every time she crossed half court, defenders instinctively started picking her up earlier and earlier. Some players began stepping out several feet beyond the three-point line, trying to disrupt the space she normally uses to launch those deep shots. But the adjustment didn't work. Because Clark wasn't just shooting from long range. She was shooting from distances that most players don't even consider part of the offense. Pull-up threes from well beyond the logo started dropping with startling consistency. Not rushed attempts. Not desperation shots. Smooth, balanced releases that looked almost routine the moment the ball left her hands. And every time the net snapped, the tension inside the gym grew a little heavier. Coaches on the sideline reportedly started exchanging quick glances. Assistants flipped through their notebooks. Veteran defenders tried to tighten their coverage. But the deeper they stepped out to contest her range, the more space opened behind them. That's when the second problem appeared. Because Clark wasn't just scoring. She was manipulating the defense. The moment defenders began overcommitting to stop those deep shots, she started attacking the gaps they created. Quick drives forced help defenders to collapse into the lane. Rotations came a half-second late. Passing lanes opened that normally wouldn't exist against experienced defenders. And Clark saw every single one of them. One possession in particular has been quietly discussed among people familiar with that scrimmage. As defenders crowded her near the top of the arc, she hesitated just long enough to freeze the help defense. The moment two players leaned toward her shooting motion, she fired a lightning-fast pass through the middle of the lane. A cutter received it perfectly in stride. Easy layup. No defender within reach. It wasn't just the pass itself that caught attention. It was the timing, the recognition, the way she seemed to anticipate where every player on the court would be moving before the defense even realized what was happening. Veterans who had spent years studying offensive tendencies suddenly found themselves reacting instead of predicting. That is a dangerous position for any defense. And it became even more dangerous when Clark started blending those passes with the threat of her shooting. The defense couldn't sit back because she would launch another deep three. They couldn't overcommit because she would find the open teammate instantly. And they couldn't slow the pace because Clark kept pushing the ball forward the moment a rebound was secured. What was supposed to be a balanced scrimmage had quietly turned into something else entirely. A demonstration. A display of offensive pressure that forced defenders to make impossible choices on every possession. If they guarded the perimeter tightly, the paint opened. If they protected the lane, the deep threes kept falling. If they doubled her near half court, she turned the trap into a passing advantage before the defenders could recover. Players who had built reputations as elite stoppers suddenly found themselves scrambling through defensive rotations that never quite arrived in time. And that's when the mood inside the gym reportedly shifted again. Because it became clear that this wasn't just a lucky run of hot shooting. It was something far more uncomfortable. The rookie who many believed still needed time to develop was systematically exposing defensive weaknesses in a group filled with some of the most decorated players in the sport. Possession after possession, the same pattern kept repeating. Defenders reacting late. Shots dropping cleanly. Teammates getting wide-open looks created by Clark's gravity. and the quiet realization on the sideline that the assumptions surrounding her readiness might have been completely wrong. But as impressive as her scoring was during that scrimmage, the most unsettling part for the defense wasn't the deep shots. It was the realization that her passing might be even more dangerous. If the deep shooting caught everyone's attention, the passing is what truly unsettled the gym. Because once the defense began stretching itself to contain the range of Caitlin Clark, Clark quietly shifted into a completely different gear. Instead of attacking the rim every time she touched the ball, she started manipulating the defense like a chessboard. Veteran defenders began stepping higher and higher to contest her shooting range. Some even picked her up before she crossed half court. The message was obvious: stop the three-point threat at all costs. But that adjustment opened the exact space Clark was waiting for. Every time two defenders leaned toward her shooting motion, she immediately punished the gap behind them. Not with slow, safe passes. With quick, aggressive darts that sliced through defensive rotations before anyone could react. What made it even more frustrating for the defense was how unpredictable those passes were. Clark rarely looked directly at the teammate she intended to hit. Her eyes would stay locked on the rim or drift toward the opposite wing, convincing defenders they were still dealing with a scoring attempt. Then suddenly the ball would fire across the floor. No hesitation. No warning. One rumored moment from that practice has been repeated again and again in basketball circles. During a crowded possession near the top of the arc, three defenders briefly converged on Clark to stop another potential deep shot. For a split second it looked like the trap had worked. But Clark never panicked. Instead, she pivoted slightly and snapped a pass through the narrowest window imaginable. The ball threaded between three extended arms and landed perfectly in the hands of a teammate cutting toward the rim. 2 steps later, the ball was in the basket. The defenders didn't even have time to turn around. Moments like that started happening over and over again. Defenses that normally rely on discipline and positioning suddenly looked disorganized. Rotations arrived late. Help defenders hesitated because they didn't know whether Clark was about to shoot from 30 feet or fire another impossible pass through traffic. And every time they guessed wrong, the offense gained another easy opportunity. What made Clark so difficult to contain wasn't just skill. It was the speed of her decision-making. Most point guards read the defense and react. Clark seemed to be reading the defense 2 moves ahead. Before a defender even stepped into a passing lane, she had already identified the next option. Before the trap fully formed, she had already calculated where the open player would appear. That kind of anticipation can completely destabilize even the best defensive units. Several players reportedly tried adjusting their strategy. Instead of trapping her aggressively, they attempted to stay disciplined and keep the defense spread out. But that approach created a new problem. Because if Clark wasn't double-teamed, she simply pulled up again. Another deep 3. Another clean swish. And with every possession, the defensive frustration inside that gym continued to grow. Veterans who were used to controlling the pace of games suddenly found themselves chasing it. Defensive schemes that had worked for years seemed to fall apart the moment Clark touched the ball. It wasn't just the scoring. It wasn't just the passing. It was the constant pressure she applied on every possession. The way she forced defenders to make decisions faster than they wanted to. The way her range stretched the floor far beyond what most teams prepare for. By the middle of the scrimmage, something unusual had started to happen on the sideline. Some coaches weren't just watching the plays anymore. They were watching Clark. Studying the way she moved. The way she read the defense. The way she controlled the tempo of the game even as the veterans tried to slow it down. Because the uncomfortable question was starting to form in the back of everyone's mind. If this is what she looks like inside a practice gym, what would she have looked like on the Olympic stage? That question is exactly why the conversation about her Olympic absence never truly went away. In fact, the deeper people looked into that decision, the more controversial it became. To understand why that scrimmage became such a massive talking point, you have to go back to the moment that started all of this. The Olympic roster announcement. When the official lineup for the United States women's national basketball team was revealed, most fans expected one name to appear automatically: Caitlin Clark. At that point, Clark wasn't just another rookie entering the professional league. She had just finished one of the most talked-about college careers in basketball history. Record-breaking scoring numbers. Historic shooting range. Packed arenas wherever she played. Television ratings that suddenly exploded every time her team appeared on national broadcasts. In many ways, she had already become the most recognizable face in women's basketball before her professional career had even fully begun. Which is why the announcement created immediate shock. Her name wasn't on the list. Instead, the roster leaned heavily toward established veterans. Players with years of international experience. Players who had already won Olympic medals and world championships. From a traditional basketball perspective, the reasoning seemed simple. Experience wins tournaments. International basketball can be physical, strategic, and unpredictable. Coaches often prefer players who have already gone through the pressure of global competition. The argument presented to the public was that the team needed chemistry and proven leadership rather than a rookie still adjusting to the professional level. At least, that was the official explanation. But the reaction from fans told a very different story. Within hours of the announcement, the debate exploded across sports media. Analysts on television questioned whether the decision truly reflected the best talent available. Social media flooded with discussions about whether the selection committee had just left the most exciting young player in the sport at home. For many fans, the explanation simply didn't add up. Clark wasn't just popular. She was producing. Even before the Olympic debate fully settled, her early professional performances were already showing flashes of the same offensive dominance that made her a college legend. Deep shooting, elite passing, the ability to completely reshape defensive strategies. Supporters argued that if the goal was to showcase the absolute best players in the country, leaving Clark off the roster made no sense. And that's when the conversation started drifting into more uncomfortable territory. Some critics began suggesting that the decision might not have been purely about basketball. They pointed to the sudden rise of a rookie who had instantly become the center of attention across the entire sport. A player whose popularity had skyrocketed so quickly that it disrupted the traditional hierarchy inside the league. The theory began circulating quietly. Maybe the roster wasn't just about experience. Maybe it was also about protecting the existing structure of the team. Veterans had spent years earning their place within the national program. Coaches had built systems around those players. Leadership roles had already been established long before Clark arrived on the scene. Introducing the most talked-about rookie in the sport could have shifted that balance dramatically. Whether that idea was true or not, the perception alone was enough to fuel an enormous wave of criticism. Every highlight Clark produced in the professional league made the debate louder. Every deep three, every spectacular assist, every sold-out arena added more pressure to a decision that already looked controversial. And then the rumors about that closed-door scrimmage began to circulate. If Clark had truly dominated a practice session against players connected to the national program, it meant the original argument about readiness suddenly looked weaker. The idea that she needed more time started sounding less convincing. Which is why the situation became even more explosive when someone inside the basketball world finally said something that many people weren't expecting. Because eventually, one of the most respected voices connected to the national program appeared to admit something remarkable. And that admission changed the tone of the entire conversation. For months after the Olympic roster announcement, the official explanation never really changed. The coaching leadership connected to the United States women's national basketball team stayed consistent with their message. Experience mattered. Chemistry mattered. The team had a structure that had already proven successful on the international stage. From their perspective, the decision had been strategic. But as the weeks passed, the public pressure didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. Every time Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional court and delivered another headline performance, the original question resurfaced. Sports networks debated it. Podcasts analyzed it. Fans argued about it across every social platform. Was the Olympic roster truly built around the best available talent? Or had the committee underestimated the impact Clark was already having on the game? Then something happened that nobody really expected. One of the most respected figures in women's basketball, Dawn Staley, made comments that instantly reignited the entire debate. Staley has long been considered one of the most influential voices in the sport. A legendary player, a championship-winning coach, and someone deeply connected to the national team ecosystem. Her opinions carry enormous weight inside basketball circles, which is why her words caught so many people off guard. During a public discussion about the Olympic roster, Staley acknowledged something that sounded surprisingly candid. If the decision could be made again, she suggested, Clark would likely be right at the top of the list. That single statement traveled across the sports world almost instantly, because it sounded like something more than just a casual compliment. To many observers, it felt like an admission. For months, the narrative surrounding Clark's absence had been firm. The team had enough experience. The system was already working. The roster didn't need changes. But Staley's words hinted that the conversation inside those decision-making rooms might not have been as unified as the public believed. In fact, it suggested something much more complicated. Maybe there had been disagreements behind closed doors. Maybe not everyone inside the selection process felt comfortable leaving out the most talked-about player in the sport. And if that was true, it raised an even bigger question. How close had Clark actually been to making the team? Because if influential voices were now openly acknowledging her impact, it meant the original decision might not have been as clear-cut as it first appeared. Fans who had criticized the roster from the beginning suddenly felt validated. Analysts revisited the debate with fresh intensity, and reporters began digging deeper into the dynamics behind the selection process. The result was a new wave of speculation. Some insiders suggested that the committee had faced enormous pressure to maintain continuity with veteran players who had already contributed to previous international victories. Others hinted that adding a high-profile rookie could have created unexpected locker room complications during a short Olympic preparation window. Whether those concerns were real or exaggerated, one thing became clear. The conversation had shifted. Instead of defending the original roster decision, the discussion was now focused on whether the committee had simply underestimated how quickly Clark's influence would grow. And the timing made that realization even more uncomfortable. Because while these debates were happening, Clark wasn't slowing down. Her performances in the professional league were becoming impossible to ignore. Night after night, she continued to deliver the same explosive offense that had first captured national attention during her college career. Which meant the Olympic conversation wasn't fading. It was evolving. Some figures inside the basketball world were beginning to acknowledge the possibility that the original decision might need to be reconsidered in the future. But not everyone was ready to accept that shift. In fact, some voices within the coaching establishment reacted very differently. And their response would only push the controversy to another level. Once the conversation started shifting, the reaction inside the coaching world became impossible to ignore. Because while some voices were beginning to acknowledge the growing influence of Caitlin Clark, others appeared determined to defend the original decision at all costs. That divide became most visible through the response of Cheryl Reeve. Reeve has built a reputation over many years as one of the most successful and disciplined coaches in professional basketball. Her teams are known for structure, physical defense, and a culture built around veteran leadership. Within the national team system, that philosophy has often been viewed as the foundation of consistent success. So when criticism around the Olympic roster started growing louder, Reeve didn't hesitate to push back. During media appearances and interviews, her responses were firm. The decision, she suggested, had been carefully evaluated. The coaching staff had prioritized experience, familiarity, and players who had already proven themselves within the national program. In her view, the debate had become exaggerated. But the problem was that the conversation outside the coaching circle was moving in the opposite direction. Every week, Clark's presence in the professional league was becoming harder to dismiss. Arena attendance numbers were climbing. Television ratings were jumping whenever her games appeared on national broadcasts. Clips of her deep three-pointers and creative passes were spreading across social media at incredible speed. Suddenly, the sport had a new center of gravity. And that reality made the Olympic debate even more complicated. Because the more Clark dominated headlines, the more the original roster decision came under scrutiny. Analysts began revisiting the selection process again and again, questioning whether the committee had underestimated the scale of the moment. Some commentators suggested that the situation represented something larger than one roster spot. It represented a generational shift. For years, The national program had been built around a stable group of veteran leaders. That system had delivered championships, Olympic medals, and global respect. From a historical perspective, it had worked perfectly. But Clark represented something different. A new era of attention. Her shooting range stretched the limits of the traditional offense. Her passing creativity turned routine plays into highlight moments. And perhaps most importantly, her popularity was drawing massive numbers of casual fans into the sport. That combination created tension between two very different priorities. One side valued continuity and proven experience. The other side believed the game was entering a new chapter that required embracing its most exciting new star. Inside locker rooms across the league, whispers about that tension reportedly began circulating as well. Some veterans were said to feel protective of the roles they had spent years earning. Others welcomed the energy Clark brought to the sport, recognizing how her presence was expanding the audience for everyone. Whether those internal dynamics were as dramatic as rumors suggested remained unclear. But the public debate had already taken on a life of its own. Every game Clark played seemed to fuel the conversation even further. Fans compared her performances to those of players who had secured Olympic roster spots. Sports shows analyzed statistics. Commentators replayed highlight clips and asked the same question over and over again. Was the sport witnessing the arrival of its next global superstar? And if that was true, could the national program afford to ignore that momentum? Meanwhile, Clark herself stayed largely focused on the court. She rarely addressed the Olympic controversy directly. Instead, she responded the way great players often do, by letting her performance speak. And what followed in the professional season would only make the original roster decision look even more controversial. While the debate around the Olympic roster continued across television panels and social media timelines, Caitlin Clark responded in the most effective way possible. She kept playing. And the deeper the professional season went, the harder it became for critics to ignore what was happening on the court. Every week seemed to produce another moment that forced the basketball world to pause. One night it was a deep three-pointer from a distance most players wouldn't even attempt. Another night it was a perfectly timed assist that slipped through a defense that had already collapsed around her. Then came the numbers. Clark began stacking performances that quickly entered the record books. Historic assist totals. Scoring bursts that electrified crowds. Triple-doubles that showcased how much control she had over the entire flow of the game. What made those performances so remarkable wasn't just the raw statistics. It was the pace at which they were happening. Rookies typically spend their first professional season adjusting, learning the speed of the league, studying defensive schemes, gradually earning the trust of coaches and teammates. Clark skipped that stage entirely. From the moment she stepped onto the professional court, she began dictating the tempo of games as if she had already been there for years. Defenses that tried to slow her down quickly discovered that her range forced them to guard territory far beyond what they normally prepared for. Once defenders stretched out to challenge those deep shots, the passing lanes opened. And Clark saw them instantly. Teammates began benefiting from that attention as well. Cuts to the basket arrived just in time to meet one of her lightning-fast passes. Shooters on the wing suddenly found themselves wide open as defenders collapsed toward Clark near the top of the arc. The offense moved faster. The spacing widened. And the results kept building. Meanwhile, many of the same veterans who had secured Olympic roster spots were facing their own challenges across the league schedule. Tough defensive matchups. Injuries. Normal ups and downs that every professional athlete experiences. But every time Clark delivered another headline performance, the comparisons started circulating again. Sports analysts highlighted the contrast. One clip would show a veteran struggling through a difficult offensive possession. The next would show Clark launching a 30-foot three or threading a pass through a tight defensive window. The debate wasn't quiet anymore. It was everywhere. Fans inside arenas began reacting before the ball even left Clark's hands, rising to their feet the moment she crossed half-court. Commentators started using phrases like generational talent and game-changing presence. Even players from opposing teams acknowledged how difficult it had become to defend her style of play. And perhaps most significantly, Clark's performances weren't just entertaining. They were winning games. Her ability to control tempo, create open shots, and stretch defenses changed the way teams prepared for matchups. Coaches had to design entirely new defensive strategies just to contain her range. Some teams tried full-court pressure. Others attempted aggressive traps near half-court. None of it fully worked, because every defensive adjustment created another opportunity somewhere else on the floor. That kind of impact is rare for any player. For a rookie, it was almost unheard of, which is why the conversation surrounding her Olympic absence became even more uncomfortable for decision-makers. Every highlight felt like a reminder. Every statistical milestone felt like another argument that the original roster decision might have underestimated something significant. Clark wasn't just performing well. She was reshaping the expectations of what a first-year professional could accomplish. And as her influence continued growing, the impact began spreading beyond the basketball court itself. Because something unexpected started happening across the entire league. As the season continued unfolding, something even bigger started happening around Caitlin Clark. It wasn't just about statistics anymore. It was about attention. For years, the WNBA had been steadily building its audience. Loyal fans followed the league closely, and the level of talent had continued rising with every new generation of players. But the sport was still fighting for consistent national spotlight in a crowded sports landscape. Then Clark arrived. Almost overnight, the atmosphere around games began to change. Arenas that had previously drawn modest crowds suddenly started filling up when Clark's team came to town. Ticket demand surged. Secondary markets reported prices climbing rapidly whenever her games were scheduled. Fans who had never watched a full WNBA broadcast before suddenly wanted to see what the excitement was about. Television networks noticed it immediately. Games featuring Clark began drawing noticeably higher ratings than average broadcasts. Sports channels that rarely discussed regular-season WNBA matchups started dedicating full segments to analyzing her performances. Highlight clips of her deep-range shooting traveled across social media platforms within minutes of happening. Everywhere the cameras turned, the same pattern kept appearing. Crowds were larger. The noise was louder. The attention was growing. Sponsors and advertisers began paying attention as well. A player capable of driving that level of interest represented something incredibly valuable for the sport's long-term growth. Executives inside broadcasting networks reportedly recognized the same thing. When Clark was on the floor, people watched. And that reality quietly reshaped the entire Olympic debate. Because the Olympic Games have always been about more than just competition. They are also about showcasing the sport to the world. The biggest stage. The largest audience. The moment when athletes become global names overnight. Which is why critics began asking an increasingly uncomfortable question. Had the national program just left its most powerful marketing force at home? The contrast became difficult to ignore. On one side, Clark was generating sold-out arenas, viral highlights, and rising television numbers across the professional league. On the other side, the Olympic roster was preparing to compete without the player who seemed to be capturing the most attention across the entire basketball landscape. For fans, the comparison felt obvious. The Olympics are supposed to showcase the best. But they are also supposed to showcase the most exciting. And Clark had quickly become both. Inside basketball circles, conversations about the situation reportedly reached boardrooms and executive meetings as well. Decision-makers within the sport understood that moments like this rarely come along. A player capable of expanding the audience, attracting casual viewers, and creating viral moments carries enormous value for any league. Some observers even suggested that the decision to leave Clark off the Olympic roster had created a missed opportunity. Instead of introducing the world to one of the most electrifying young stars in basketball, the international tournament would unfold without the player currently driving the most attention in the sport. Whether that perspective was fair or not, the perception alone carried enormous weight. Because sports narratives are shaped not just by results, but by moments. And Clark was producing moments almost every night. Meanwhile, the physical battles she faced on the court were becoming more intense. Defenses across the league understood exactly what she represented. Every opponent wanted to prove they could slow her down. Every matchup carried an extra layer of motivation. And the way those battles played out would soon create another major storyline surrounding her rise. As the spotlight around Caitlin Clark kept growing, something else began happening on the court. The games started getting tougher. Not just strategically tougher, physically tougher. Opposing teams understood exactly what Clark represented. She wasn't just another rookie trying to find her rhythm in the professional league. She had already become the player drawing the largest crowds, the loudest media attention, and the biggest defensive game plans. And when a player becomes the center of that much attention, every opponent wants to be the one who slows them down. Night after night, Clark walked into arenas where defenders were prepared to challenge every movement she made. Guards picked her up far beyond the three-point line. Screens were fought through aggressively. Bodies collided in the paint as players tried to disrupt her rhythm. Some games looked less like a normal rookie adjustment period and more like a full defensive campaign designed specifically to test her limits. Hard contact became routine. Defenders bumped her off screens. Traps came faster. Rotations closed harder than usual whenever she launched one of those deep shots. Every possession seemed to carry a little more physical intensity. For some young players, that kind of environment can become overwhelming. The speed of the professional game is already difficult enough. Add constant defensive pressure and physical contact, and many rookies begin playing cautiously. Clark didn't. If anything, the pressure appeared to sharpen her focus. After absorbing a tough foul on one possession, she would calmly return on the next trip down the floor and pull up from 30 feet. When defenders crowded her near half court, she responded by slipping another pass through traffic for an open teammate. Each response seemed to send the same message. The attention wasn't going to slow her down. In fact, the more aggressive defenses became, the more determined Clark appeared to be. Her composure during those moments became one of the most impressive aspects of her game. No dramatic reactions. No public complaints. Just a quiet reset and another possession. That approach began earning respect across the league. Opposing players still defended her with intensity, but many acknowledged the challenge she presented. Guarding someone who can shoot from that far away forces defenders to operate outside their normal comfort zone. And Clark understood exactly how to exploit that discomfort. If defenders stepped too close, she drove past them. If they sagged back, she launched another deep shot. If help defenders collapsed into the lane, the ball found an open shooter on the wing. Every defensive adjustment created another opportunity. Meanwhile, the media conversation surrounding her continued expanding. Analysts debated whether the physical style of defense she faced was simply part of the professional game or evidence of how seriously opponents were taking the challenge of containing her. Either way, the result remained the same. Clark kept producing. Every highlight added another chapter to the growing narrative surrounding her rookie season. Every sold-out arena reinforced the idea that something significant was happening inside the sport. And as the season progressed, one realization became harder and harder for the basketball world to ignore. The debate that began with one Olympic roster decision had evolved into something much larger. It was no longer just about whether Clark should have been included. It was about what her rise represented for the future of the sport itself. When the Olympic roster was first announced, many people believed the story would eventually fade away. The tournament would happen. Medals would be awarded. The conversation would move on to the next season. But that's not what happened. Instead, the debate surrounding Caitlin Clark only grew stronger as her professional career began unfolding in real time. Every performance, every highlight, every sold-out arena added new fuel to a conversation that refused to disappear. Because Clark represents something unique. She combines elite skill with a style of play that feels electric to watch. Her deep shooting stretches defenses beyond their limits. Her passing transforms ordinary possessions into unforgettable highlights. And her presence has drawn an entirely new wave of attention toward women's basketball. Moments like that don't happen often in sports. They signal the arrival of a new era. Whether people agree with the Olympic decision or not, one thing has become clear. Clark's influence on the game is already enormous, and her career is still only beginning. Which leaves one final question hanging in the air. If the basketball world is already witnessing the rise of one of its most exciting stars, what happens when she eventually reaches the global stage? Because when that moment finally arrives, the entire sport may look very different. And before you go, there's something quick that helps this channel grow and bring you more stories like this. If you enjoyed this breakdown, take a second to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your opinion. Engagement like that tells the YouTube algorithm that people want more deep basketball stories like this, and it helps the channel reach new fans who love the game just as much as you do. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned, because the next chapter of this story might be even bigger.